Okay, so I think just about everybody in here has been going through the Bible study we've been doing on the end times. This is going to tie into that next week with the video that we're going to play next week. However, I don't think he goes in depth enough because it's really not what he's trying to teach at the moment to show what we could get out of this. What I'm going to get into is going to be much more in depth than what he's going to in this particular area. He just touches on it to make a point that he's trying to make for his end times Bible study that he's doing. So I wanted to take a pause tonight and just concentrate on this one topic because I think we'll get a lot out of it and I think you'll find it somewhat interesting. So everybody in here, I know almost everybody in here, we believe the Bible is the unerrant Word of God. That it is, there is no error in it, that it's truth from front to back, that if anything contradicts it, the Bible would be the primary source of information, that's what we're going to take as truth. However, if you were here last week and we looked at the Jewish festival for the Jewish Bridal Festival, it taught us something about when Christ used metaphors and gave examples, he would use what the Jewish people understood at the time. And when he talked about the wedding supper and the brides waiting for the groom and all those examples that he used out of the Bible or in the Bible that tied into the wedding, when we looked at the Jewish wedding last week, it helped us understand what it was that he was talking about. It gave us a better description of it. We're going to do the same thing tonight, but with some of the miracles that Jesus taught or did, and with some of the things that the Pharisees taught. Not just the Pharisees, but the Jewish leaders in general. Okay, there's things that they taught the people that contradicted the Word of God, and Jesus basically used some of these miracles to point out those contradictions and to force them to look at what it was they were teaching and then force the people to make a choice between what he was saying and what they were being taught. Okay, so to do this, we're going to look at a few different things tonight. And I plan on getting this all done in one night. However, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask them. If we have to drag it out, we will. I am not going to rush through this because there's a lot of material in it. The 18 pages you have in front of you tells you there's a lot of material in it. Basically, what you have in front of you is my notes and the slides. So everything I put up here, you have there. If you want to just look at the slides, that's fine. Or you can write on the notes if you want, or just go through them later. Okay? So they're all the same thing. So as we get going, the things we're going to look at is the first thing I want you to look at is I've got a handout, the very top page. Kind of keep that out separate, okay? Because we're going to look at that a few times. And basically, there's 37 miracles recorded in the Bible that Jesus performed. This list that I gave you puts them somewhat in order. It's not exact, but it's really close. And the reason it's not exact is because the same miracles are in different books of the Bible, and I did not put this together. I got this off the internet, but you can see he's trying to line up the books of the Bible with the miracle, and sometimes because you've got some things not described in certain books and other things described in them, they don't exactly line up, but it gives us a very general idea of the order that Jesus performed these miracles in. So kind of keep this on top, and we'll refer to it throughout the night. Okay, so the other question we kind of have to ask ourselves is, because we're going to look at the way people responded to these miracles, okay? So, one of the things we have to ask ourselves was, how common were miracles in this day, or with these being Jewish taught people? Jews, they're Jews by nationality, but they're also, a lot of these are also Jews by religion. So they were taught things as they grew up and while they were in the church. Were they exposed to miracles in the past, or was a miracle something they'd never even heard of? We're going to look at that and see what types of miracles they were exposed to. And the reason that's important is because then when we start seeing their reaction to them, it tells us what their thought process is. Because if you take the average person off the street right now who's never seen a miracle, heard of a miracle, or even believed miracles ever occurred, and then they see a miracle, their thought process towards that miracle is going to be different than somebody who's, say, been raised in a church where they might have seen somebody healed, or they've seen some type of a miracle before, or they at least believe it can occur. They've been taught it can occur. So we're going to look at that thought process. The other thing that we're going to look at is we're going to define some of the Jewish words we're going to talk about, specifically the leaders, because there's various different leaders mentioned in the Bible, Jewish leaders, and you see the name, but if you don't understand what their role was, it makes it harder to understand what's going on. So we're going to look at those things as we go along. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Talmud. Not sure I'm pronouncing it 100% right, but we're going to, it's the Talmud. So what the Talmud is it's a grouping of Jewish teachings. For the first they started putting it together about 1200 years BC, but it was all oral. Not much of it was written. And it's just tradition that's passed along from teacher to teacher. For the most part, it stayed fairly accurate. In about 300 AD, they actually wrote it down. They actually wrote it down in two different places. There's one called the Jerusalem Talmud and one called the Babylonian Talmud. They have some different stuff in them, but they're a lot the same, and those were written in about 300 or 400 AD after death. But they take stories that go back verbally all the way to 1200 BC. Okay? And this is what was basically added on top of the Bible to teach people how to live a Jewish life. Not necessarily a biblical life, but a Jewish life. So we're going to talk some about these traditions that have been passed on and why the people thought the way they did. Okay, and the next we're going to look at some different Jewish leaders. You hear about them in the Bible, and it's like, okay, well, what's the difference and why is it important? It's important because of their roles and what occurs as we're looking at these stories. So the first one we're going to look at is a rabbi. A rabbi was basically a person who was thoroughly taught in Jewish tradition, the Torah and the Talmud, and any type of Jewish religious traditions. If you remember correctly in the Bible, Jesus was actually called a rabbi in several places because he was such a good teacher and he was well taught that he was considered a rabbi. So other than that, it's kind of a generic term, but it means that somebody that is a religious teacher of the Jewish religion is what a rabbi is. The other one we're going to look at is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a legal council. You could look at it as our judicial system. There was either 23 or 72 rabbis, depending upon the size of the town. It was a religious council set up by the Jews, but it dealt with their laws. And if you had anything legal going on, they would decide it. It's basically the same as coming before a court today. That was their court. When Jesus was tried, before he was sent to Pilate, Jesus was tried by the Sanhedrin. As we start looking here later on where they're investigating some of Jesus' miracles, they're taking the miracles and reporting it back to the Sanhedrin, who's trying to decide what they're going to do about it. Okay? The other one we're going to look at is the Pharisees. You've all heard the term Pharisees. Okay, so they were known specifically for their personal piety and their adherence to religious tradition. They were very much about, if you remember, Paul said, I was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. Basically, they lived by the law to the best of their abilities, or at least in open. Probably not behind closed doors because they were somewhat of hypocrites. But their whole goal in life was to live the Jewish law perfectly. Not only that, then they heaped on top of it all of these other laws that were passed down in the Talmud. And they were very much steeped in religious tradition. Much of what they did was religious tradition more than it was actually biblical. And that becomes very important as we look at some of these miracles as we go along. Next group of people is the Sadducees. So you've heard the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The other thing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees both is basically to become one, it was basically done by bloodline. It wasn't, it was an elite class of people. These were the very important people of the day. So this was done more by tradition than what your actual abilities were or anything that you did to achieve it. The difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees was the Sadducees believed in resurrection. They believed that you could, that you would basically have life after death. The Pharisees believed in life after death. The Sadducees did not. They believed that once you died, you were dead. The other difference between them is while the Pharisees were very much steeped in Jewish verbal tradition, the Sadducees were not. If it wasn't in the Bible, they didn't necessarily feel they had to follow it. They were pretty much went by the Torah, and that was their main focus, was the Torah. The last thing you're going to hear mentioned is a scribe. Kind of a generic term, however, it has some meaning in the Bible. You'll see that it's talking about the scribes and the Pharisees. Basically, by trade, a scribe was someone who wrote stuff down. They transcribed stuff from one, like if you needed a copy of the Bible, you would hire a scribe to write you a copy of the Bible, and his job was to make sure it was done perfectly. It was an exact translation. They would also take stories and write them and turn them into a written book. In the early Jewish history, there was a lot of illiteracy. Your traditional Jewish, or not traditional, but your middle class and lower class Jewish people were illiterate. So most of what they did was by verbal tradition, what was passed on from one generation to the next verbally. The scribes would write a lot of this stuff down. The other thing about the scribes that's interesting, or that's important, is because they translated so much law, a lot of times they were called into court to testify as legal experts. While they didn't sit in judgment themselves, you might find one of them testifying against you in a criminal case. Because they knew the law so well, because they wrote it, they a lot of times would testify to it. So you'll find in here where it talks about the scribes being in places where they're watching Jesus, and the whole reason is because then they may be called to testify to what they saw Jesus do versus what the law said. And they may be called to testify before the Sanhedrin to that. So that's why their presence there is important.
So with the scribes, were they also by bloodline?
No, scribe, the one thing about, that's a good question. The one thing about the scribes was, it was a job. If you could do the job well, you got the job. Most of it was not done by bloodline. It was done by your ability to perform the task. And a lot of the scribes were actually Pharisees, or I'm sorry, not Pharisees, they were rabbis. A lot of the scribes were actually rabbis. So you had the Jewish, or the legal teaching, plus the Torah or Old Testament biblical teaching combined in a lot of them. But yeah, that's a good question. They were actually, of this group, they were the ones who weren't handed it down to them. They had to actually earn it. Okay. So, one of the things we said we were going to look at is, what was the people's exposure to miracles? Did they think it was something that never happened, or was it kind of I don't want to say common, but it was something they'd heard of before? So, at this time, obviously, the New Testament hadn't been written, so anything written down comes from the Old Testament. So, were there miracles performed in the Old Testament? Can anybody, I've got some up here, but can anybody give me an example of some of the miracles that were performed in the Old Testament? Don't have to be healings. What were some of the things that happened? Go ahead.
Parting of the Red Sea.
Parting of the Red Sea. That was a major miracle. Huh?
Water to wine?
That would have been New Testament, Jesus. Old Testament.
Elijah's wet fire.
Elijah's wet fire, burning up the fire, the water with the fire. Yes.
Turning like the rock to water?
Right. Having water come out of the rock. Correct. And then you've got. Go ahead.
Naaman.
Yeah, Naaman, good. We're gonna talk about Naaman in just a second. Yeah, Naaman.
Okay.
And then you had all of the plagues of Israel. I'm sorry, all the plagues of Egypt for not wanting to let Israel go. So, and those were all, they're miracles. I mean, they were plagues, but they were still done miraculously. Then you have the ones that I've got up here. You've got in Kings. You've got
Elijah?
Yeah, Elijah was one of the major. So Elijah raises a couple people from the dead. One of them's in 1 Kings 17, where he laid himself over the body of the child and asked him to revive the child, and the child's soul came back. So there's a raising of the dead, which we see in Jesus' time. So it's something they've heard of. happening before. You have in 2 Kings 20, you have Isaiah healing someone of a boil or some type of a lesion that was actually killing. He was actually dying from it. And God had originally had him prophesy that he was going to die from it. The king changed his heart, and Isaiah was able to heal him because the Lord allowed him to heal him. And then King Jeroboam, who had his hand restored to him after God had crippled it for things he was doing wrong. So you have several healings in the Old Testament that occurred. So in the New Testament, when people see healings, it's not something that's unheard of. It's something that they believe could have happened, okay? Whether they've seen them or not at this point in time, it's still something they believe could have happened. So, what we're going to look at is, you have a page right after that that's called the 4 Messianic Miracles, and we are going to talk about that in depth for just a second.
Do you think Hezekiah's miracle of getting to live another, what was it, 15 years?
Correct. Yes.
That people knew about?
Yeah, he's the one that Isaiah healed, correct. He was supposed to die like, he's supposed to die like that day or real close to it, and he got an extra 15 years because he turned his heart, changed his heart. That is correct. Okay, so I'm going to tell you, first thing, disclaimer, just so you know where I'm getting a lot of the material, not all, but a lot of the material I'm going to show you today comes from Dr. Arnold Buchenbaum. That's about as close as I'm going to get. He's a Jewish professor, very, very well steeped in Jewish tradition and Jewish history. You just type in his name online, he's got a whole web page of information. So a lot of what I got here today came from him. He is not the only one who teaches this, but he does a very good job of laying it out and showing how it fit, the Jewish tradition fit into what you see in the Bible. So that's where I got a lot of this from. So, the 4 things that it was said that only the Messiah could do, that the only person who could do this actual physical healing was the Messiah, was the healing of a Jewish leper, the casting out of a demon from a person who could not speak, healing of a man born blind, and raising a person from the dead after 4 days. These are miracles that the religious elite or the Jewish elite taught that a lot of people could do other miracles when inspired by God or when God allowed it. These 4 miracles were something that they set aside that said that only the Messiah could do. And they specifically taught that only the Messiah could do it, and that when you saw somebody doing it, that person might be the Messiah. So this was taught up until Jesus' time. It was passed down in the Torah, along with a lot of other Jewish traditional writings, okay? So let's just, from our knowledge of the Bible that we know now, basically we understand Jesus wanted no man to perish, right? That he gives everybody a chance. That John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes on him will not perish but have eternal life. So I believe, and I believe it's biblical, that God gives every person a chance. That they come to them in some way and say, this is who I am, either choose me or not. Okay, and what you're going to see with this is, if you remember, as you get a little further into the Gospels, Jesus gets very confrontational with the Pharisees, specifically the Pharisees. He gets very confrontational with them, but he doesn't in the beginning. In the beginning, he's not as he speaks to them and he tries to give them information, but he's not as confrontational as he is towards the end. And you always have to look at that and say, well, why? Why did he get so confrontational with these people? I'm going to show you why. This is going to tell you why, as we get further along, he's getting more and more confrontational with them. Because he is giving them everything they've taught up to this point. He's using their own teachings to prove to them who he is. And in doing so, he's making them choose to either accept him or reject him. And along the way, they're either going to turn the people towards him, or they're going to try and turn the people away from him. So that's Jesus' whole point in doing this, is to give them the chance to accept him like they were supposed to. So we're going to take an in-depth look at these miracles. And we're going to look at several things. We're going to look at what Jewish tradition taught on each of the 4 miracles. We're going to take a brief look at each miracle and see why it was taught that only the Messiah could do it. We're going to look at how Jesus used those miracles to basically force the Jewish leaders to make a decision about who he was. And then we're going to look at how the crowd reacted. Because it's very interesting. You're going to see he's going to perform certain miracles. Some of those miracles, the crowd's going to react one way. Some of them, they're going to react another. Some of them, the Jewish leaders react one way. Some of them, they react another. And you're going to see why. It becomes very important to see how the crowd reacts to this. So the first one we're going to look at is we're going to look at the healing of a leper. Now, on your little chart that you've got, the 37 miracles of Jesus, this is number 7. It's where he cleanses a man from leprosy. What I'd like you to note about that is how close to the beginning of his ministry this is. He has not been ministering very long at all when he performs this first miracle. And there is a reason that he chose the specific sickness of leprosy to heal. There was some things that went along with it that the Jewish leaders had to perform that forced them to look into him further. Okay? So we're going to look at this first healing in Matthew 8. And it says, I'm reading out of Matthew 8, starting in verse 1. It says, when he had come down from the mountains, great multitudes followed him, and behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can clean me. Now, to begin with, that doesn't sound like much of a statement. It just sounds like somebody who's saying, you know what, God, I've seen you do some of these other miracles, and I believe that you can probably heal me too. Because I've seen you heal a couple other people. He's performed a few other miracles at this point in time. He's probably heard some about him. But there's more to this statement. First, he calls him Lord, which is basically it's like calling him Christ. The other thing he says, I believe you can heal me. With Jewish teaching that only the Messiah could heal a leper, he's basically saying, I know you're the Messiah, and I know you can heal me. Because Jewish tradition taught that the only person that could do this was the Messiah. So there's meaning just in the way he says it. The next thing you see is then Jesus put his hand out and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed, and immediately his leprosy was cleansed. There's significance in that. What is the only way that in Jewish law, there was a lot of ways you could be defiled. If you touched a dead body, you could be defiled. If you touched an unclean animal, you could be defiled. What was the only way, or the only reason to be defiled touching a living person? If they had leprosy. If once Jesus touched him, by Jewish tradition, he was now defiled. Okay? So just in him being willing to touch him, he was breaking Jewish traditional cleanliness laws, because he should not have touched him. Matter of fact, there was a certain distance they had to stay away from, the lepers had to stay away from people so that they wouldn't touch them. Okay, so Jesus touches him and he's healed. And what's the next thing that happened? It says, and Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as testimony to them. So Jesus tells him to tell nobody, but go show yourself to the Pharisee, basically to the religious elite. Now, let's back this up just a second more, because this becomes important later. If you look at Leviticus 13, which I think I have that on the next slide. Okay, so if you go back to the Old Testament, you look at Leviticus 13 and 14. Leviticus 13 tells all of the ways that they were to test for leprosy. It basically laid out a whole process of things they had to do to test to see if a person was leprous. Okay. Leviticus 14 was what to do if someone was actually healed of leprosy. Okay? It gave all of the things they were supposed to do to test to make sure they were healed. Now, the only person in the Old Testament or the only people, I'm sorry, the only people in the Old Testament and up till Jesus' time in Israel who could declare a person leprous was the religious leaders. It was the priests. That was the only, so if you believed you were a leper, or somebody believed you were a leper, they would send you to the priest. The priest would go through all of the requirements of Leviticus 13, and they would either say, you are leprous or you aren't. Okay, and then from there you would either be sent out of the community or brought back into the community depending upon the decision. So the Jewish leaders had a record of every person that had been declared leprous. So when Jesus sent this man to the priests and said, go declare yourself to the priest, they would have already had a record that he was a leper. And when he walked in the door and said, I'm clean, they would have had to go back and check, make sure he was a leper, and then start the procedure to determine if he was truly healed or not. Okay? So, the beginning of the procedure is a sacrifice, well, not a sacrifice of 2 doves. 2 doves are brought, one sacrifice, one's dipped in the blood of the other one, and it's let go. I'm very much paraphrasing it. There's a lot more to it than that. But basically, you're taking 2 doves, one's sacrificed, one's released, and then for 7 days, the man is allowed back into the community, but he has to sit outside his tent. So there's a 7-day period set aside to where they're going to observe him and watch him. Okay? Now, because no Jew had ever been cured of leprosy. Okay, real quick, we're going to back up. We're going to look at what's happened with leprosy in the past, and then we're going to go into what they decided to do. Okay, so 2 people are mentioned in the Bible as being cured of leprosy, okay? The first is Miriam. She had opposed Moses, and God took exception to it. And she was immediately struck with leprosy. And sorry, guys. In Numbers, it said, when the cloud departed from above the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Now, the Bible does not specifically say she was healed, but it's inferred in the text. It says, so Moses cried out to her, saying, Lord, please heal her, O God, I pray. Then the Lord said to Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, would she not be shamed for 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp for 7 days, and afterwards she may be received again. So the inference in the text is she was set aside leprous for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, she was healed. And then later in the Bible, it talks about her being back in the encampment. So we can infer that she was healed after the 7 days. The interesting thing about this is Moses did not heal her. Moses sent her out for 7 days. While she was out, God healed her. No man touched her and healed her. Okay, like you had with Elisha, where he laid his body over the boy and requested his life come back. Elisha touched him. God allowed him to heal him, and he was healed. That's not what happened in the case of the leper. And interesting, in our Bible study that we've been doing on Revelation, what does 7 stand for? Completeness. So she was set aside for 7 days. At the end of the 7 days, God considered her punishment complete, and she was allowed to come back. She was not healed by any human touch. The second one was Naaman. He's the commander of the Syrian army. He developed leprosy. He was sent to see Elisha. Elisha told him, I'm paraphrasing here, but Elisha tells him to go dip in the river 7 times, and at the end of the 7th time he would be healed. After complaining about it a lot and thinking Elisha's messing with him, he finally goes and does it. And after dipping in the river 7 times, he is healed. Elisha's not even present. He's not even there when this occurs. So Elisha did not touch him and heal him. He was healed by God. Okay? Again, he dipped 7 times, and what's the meaning of 7? Is completeness. Yes, ma'am.
Matter of fact, he didn't even talk to Naaman. He sent his servant, Gehazi, to talk to Naaman.
That is correct. And when the servant came back and said what?
Really ticked
He was
him
upset. That's correct. So, because no priest had ever got to put into effect or use Leviticus 14, no priest had ever declared somebody clean, they decided that the only person that could touch and cleanse someone was God, and the only way a man could do it was if he was God in the flesh, or the Messiah. So they had been teaching this for years, that the only person who could cleanse a leper was God in the flesh or the Messiah. Okay. Okay, so we've now Jesus has now cleansed our leper, sent him to see the priest. We know that by Jewish tradition and even biblical law in Leviticus 14, he has to be set aside for 7 days. Because no Jew has ever been healed of leprosy, and they now have one, Jewish tradition stated that they had to investigate it. That is why Jesus chose leprosy to be one of his first ministry, or one of his first healings, is because it forced the Jewish elite to investigate why this person was healed. They had to first verify that he had been a leper, which would have been easy because they would have had the records of it. Then they had to verify that he had truly been cured. And if he had been cured, they had to find out why. And the reason they had to find out why was because if it was done by human hand, human touch, the only person they believed could do that was the Messiah. So Jesus, in using the leprosy and in healing this person towards the very beginning of his ministry, is now basically getting in the face of the Jewish elite and saying, here I am, by your own law, you have to investigate what I'm doing. You have no choice. Now, very interesting, and you're going to see it as this plays out. You're going to see, while this isn't written in the Bible, you're going to see how the people handle it to see that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so we covered that. So on the next page, what I want to point out here is that, okay, so according to Sanhedrin law, if there was any kind of Messianic movement, which a healing of a leper would be a Messianic movement, something that pointed towards the Messiah, there was 2 stages. The first thing they had to do was they had to go and they had to observe, but they could not ask questions. The only thing they could do for a period of about 7 days or longer, depending upon how long it took them to come to some type of a conclusion, was observe what was going on. Okay? They could not ask questions about it. They could not investigate it any other way. All they could do was just observe. Okay? Once that 7-day period was over, they would come back to the Sanhedrin. Remember, we've got our Jewish court. They would come back to the Sanhedrin and they would say, this looks credible or it looks uncredible. Okay? If it looks uncredible, if it didn't appear to be any type of a Messianic movement or something that they could explain, then the issue was just dropped and it was done. However, if it was considered credible, if they came back and they said, hey, the dude was definitely a leper, he's definitely clean now, and this person touched him to do it. Now they have to investigate it further. And so after the observation stage, then becomes the interrogation phase. And they were very good at interrogating people. So you're going to see, as we look at the next several miracles, you're going to see some of the miracles where they're in the observation phase, and then you're going to see later where they move into the interrogation phase. And you're actually going to see this played out in the scriptures as we look at it. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the next miracle he performed, which is almost in one of the books that's actually in the same chapter, and a couple of the others. This is actually played out in, it's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is not one of the Messianic miracles. However, the reason we're going to look at it is because to observe the way both the people are reacting now to Jesus and the way the Jewish elite are reacting to Jesus. Okay? So this is on your handout that I gave you of the 37 miracles. This is number 9. Okay? It's recorded in 3 of the 4 books of the Bible. It's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to look just briefly at all 3 because all 3 authors tell us something different. They're not contradictory, they just give us a different piece of the puzzle. Okay, so we're going to look at all 3 of them. The first one, the one that's very interesting, is Mark. So in Mark 2, 1 through 12, Mark points out, and I'm not going to read it specifically, I'm just going to tell you the important part of it. Mark points out that the incident occurred in Capernaum, in Galilee, which is miles from Jerusalem. Okay, so if you're in Capernaum and you traveled from Jerusalem, it took you time to get there. This was not just like walking next door, okay? The reason that's important is when we get to who was there. So now Luke, so Mark tells us where it occurred at, Luke tells us who was there. Okay, so I'm going to Luke 5:17. Now it happened on a certain day, as he was teaching, he being Jesus, that there were Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting by, who had come out of every town in Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem. This was just not a couple guys sitting there on the wayside listening to him preach. He now had people from all over the region coming to watch him. And the reason was, he had just healed a leper, which could only be done by the Messiah. So that's why when you read that and all those people are sitting there, that's why they're there. Is because he's now performed a miracle that can't be performed.
The word got around, huh?
The word, well, yeah, the word got around, and not only that, yeah, they've now, so this has come back to the Sanhedrin, that he's done this, and the Sanhedrin are now sending these people out saying, go investigate it, and come back here and tell me what's going on. Okay? So that's what's going on. And I'm going to point out here a couple more things about it in just a second. It's very interesting. Okay, so I'll read Matthew 9. When Jesus saw their faith, let me back up. What's just happened is they've just taken the roof off the house and lowered the paralyzed man down because they couldn't get in because there were so many people there. So they've lowered him down in front of Jesus so that Jesus could heal him. It says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, and this part's coming out of Matthew, "Son, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven you." At once, some of the scribes, Luke also includes the Pharisees, so there are scribes and Pharisees there, now look, where it says, said within themselves, this man is blasphemous. Notice at this point, they are not saying anything to Jesus. And why are they not saying anything to Jesus? They can't. They're in the observation phase. Right now, they cannot challenge Jesus because by their own law, they're in the observation phase right now. They have to just watch.
Holy smokes.
Unfortunately for them, Jesus knows what they're thinking. It says, but Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, why do you think evil in your hearts? So he's already starting to say, hey, look, guys, I'm giving you the chance, and you're sitting here thinking evil. Why are you doing this? Okay? Now this is interesting. I never looked at this way before until I did the research, and I didn't get this off of the one guy's website that I pointed out. I got it someplace else. I had never looked at this before this way. It says, for Jesus said, which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or arise and walk? Now think about that. Jesus didn't say which is easier to do. He said which is easier to say. Okay? So if you got somebody who's a fake, it's easy for me to walk up and say your sins are forgiven, and there's no way to prove it. So that's what Jesus is saying. He's not saying which is it easier for me to do, for me to say your sins are forgiven or to heal you. He's saying which is it easier to say. So basically he's saying if I was a fraud, I would be saying your sins are forgiven and that would be it. I'd be done because I couldn't do anything else. But to prove to you I'm not a fraud, we'll go on. It says, so which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven or arise and walk, but that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. Arise, take up your bed, and go to your house. And he arose and departed the house. So basically he's saying, I'm saying I can forgive sins, but you can't see that, but you're going to watch this guy get up and walk. And so he tells him, get up and walk, and he does. So he's proving his authority to forgive sins by then healing the man in front of him. Now, look at what the multitudes say. It says, now when the multitude saw it, they marveled and glorified God who had given power to men, such power to men. Okay, so they marveled at it. They said, this is great. They don't say it's impossible. They just said it's great. We're going to look at a couple more things, and they're actually going to get to the point where it's saying, this is impossible. He shouldn't be able to do this. Right now, they're not there. They're just looking, because this is one of the miracles that the Pharisees said could be performed by a mortal man. You don't have to be the Messiah to heal someone who's paralyzed, because it's been done before. It was done in the Old Testament. We looked at the one guy's hand, Jeroboam's hand, who was withered, and it was healed. So this isn't an impossible feat. It's been done before. So while they're in awe of it, they're not to the point of where they're saying, how can this have happened? Okay? The interesting thing about this is that you see that the Pharisees and the scribes right now are bound by their own law to not be able to ask questions. That's why they're saying it in their heart and not saying it out loud.
And they can't even come back at it.
They can't even come back at him yet. They're forced to sit there and listen to him. That's it exactly.
Wow.
Okay. So now we're going to look at the next one. We're going to look at the healing of a mute person with a demon. Okay, so we've looked at the, so he's done, he's cleansed the leper, which is towards the beginning. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at healing a person with a mute person with a demon. Okay, and that's very specific. It's not just healing someone who's demonically possessed, because that's been done. As a matter of fact, the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, they had specific people who were exorcists who could do that. They could go out and they could cast out demons. And we're going to look at how they did it and what their process was for it. But there was a part of their process that required them to get the demon to talk, and if the demon wouldn't talk, they were helpless. They couldn't do it. So we're going to look at that in depth right now. And this is number 3 on your list, okay? Oh, I'm sorry. The first one we're going to look at, I'm sorry, let me back up because we're going to give an example. So the first one we're going to look at is number 3 on your list. This person is not mute. This is just an average person possessed by a demon. Nothing big. Okay? And we're going to look at the way the crowd reacts to him when he does it, okay? So we're looking at Luke 4. This is number 3 on your list of miracles. And it says, then he went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. And now look at where they're at. Okay, he's teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astonished at his teachings, for his word was with authority. Now in the synagogue, there was a man who had a spirit of an unclean demon. So they're in church, and in church with them is this man who's possessed by an unclean demon. Okay?
You mean Satan goes to church?
Evidently. And he cried out with a loud voice, saying, let us alone. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. He's in the synagogue in the middle of a whole bunch of people, and while it doesn't say it, you know there was a whole bunch of religious leaders there. There had to have been. He's on the Sabbath in the synagogue. So he's got a heck of a crowd, and the demon just called him the Holy One of God. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. And when the demon had thrown him in the midst, it came out of him and did not hurt him. Then they were amazed and spoke among themselves, saying, what word is this? For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirit, and they come out. And the report about him went into every place in the surrounding region. Okay, so they're amazed again. Yeah, this is pretty amazing. We don't see this every day. He cast out a demon. But they're not saying it's impossible, and they're not saying it's never been done. They're just saying, wow, he's got the power to do this, okay? So that's the first, and this is towards the beginning of his ministry. Well, actually, one about his 3rd miracle. But the miracle with the leper hasn't happened yet, okay? Now we're going to look at the next one. Now this is 17 on your list. And this is the first mute that he cast the demon out of, okay? And we're only going to look at this one briefly. We're going to go into more depth in the next one. The only reason I'm looking at this one is because of the statement of the people, okay? So Matthew 9:32, as they went out, behold, they brought him a man, mute and demon-possessed. And when the demon was cast out, the mute spoke, and the multitudes marveled, saying, it was never seen like this in Israel before. So you've got the first one being cast out in the temple, and they're like, wow, he has a lot of power. That's pretty cool, he did this, and it spreads. Now he casts out a mute with a demon, and they say it has never been done in Israel before. So there's your distinction from the people, saying the difference between your standard demon-possessed person and your mute demon-possessed person, okay? Once he cast the demon out of the mute, it raised the level of who he's saying he is. Okay, now, and remember, this has happened after, the mute demon has happened after he cured the man of leprosy. So by this time, they're all watching him. Okay, all the religious leaders are starting to watch him now. So we're going to go to the next one here. This one we're going to go into a little bit more in depth. This is Matthew 12. Okay, now this is number 29 on your list. However, this is one of the ones where I talked about where it's not exactly in order. The reason it's number 29 is because they're also tying it into Luke, which is a lot further, which has it a lot further down. It actually should sit about number 17 on your list. It should be right about where the man, another man's healed who is unable to speak. Okay, so it should be right after that. On the list, it makes it look like it happened later on than it actually did. But we're going to look at this in depth, okay? So Matthew 12. It says, then one was brought to him who was demon-possessed, blind and mute. And he healed him, so that the blind mute man both spoke and saw. And all the multitudes were amazed. And what do they say? Could this be the Son of David? So what are they now looking at him and thinking?
Messiah.
This is the Messiah. He just did something that our teachers taught us could only be done by the Messiah, the Son of David. But what do the Pharisees say? And when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "This fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons." And then Jesus has to confront them on that. Because what are their options right now? So they've been teaching for 1,000 years that the only person that could cast out a mute demon is the Messiah. And he's just done it twice. What are their two choices?
That he is the
There's no
Messiah?
other except or not.
Or they have to come up with a reason.
Yeah.
And what? Yes, sir.
For I don't know how many pages before, you're talking about, well, he's the Messiah, then he's the Messiah. I always felt, and of course, I'm different, I was raised a Catholic, so
Sure.
it's strange to me. But if he was the Messiah, why did so many people not accept him?
You know what? It's funny because we're actually going to look at that a little bit later because you're right. So I think the people are trying to accept him, but they've got the religious leaders coming in and saying, no. What we told you all along, this isn't him. Even though he's doing everything he told them. And I'll give you the short answer because we're going to look at it towards the end of the lesson. We're going to look at it. They were afraid because as soon as this guy became the Messiah, they now lost their jobs. Their whole livelihood is now gone. Everything about them now ceases to exist if he's the Messiah. Can you, let's play with that for a second. You are so insecure that you've got the Jesus Christ standing in front of you, the Messiah, proving to you who he is, and you're so worried about losing your job that you're going to have to try and defame him.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but what's the statement?
Pride goeth before the fall.
Well, that's a good one, but I was thinking the heart is desperately wicked and who can know it? Well, that's your perfect example of the pride of the heart being desperately wicked and not being able to know it, is you got these people who are now basically being forced to see that he's the Messiah by their own teaching, and they would rather say that he comes from Satan. That's okay. So, and then Jesus even kind of rubs it in their face a little bit. So now when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "This fellow does not cast out demons except for by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons." But Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, "And if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by who do your sons cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, surely the kingdom has come to you." And the reason he's saying that about this demon is because this demon was mute. And they taught that he was the only one who could cast out a mute demon. So he's basically taking their own teaching and saying, if I just did what I did, then the only answer is, I'm the Son of God. The kingdom's come. Okay. So we're going to look at casting out demons within the Pharisees' framework. What did they say about it? Because it was done. It was there was actually people who did it. Okay. So casting out demons within the framework of the Pharisaic Judaism required one to use a specific ritual which included 3 stages. Now, mind you, this ritual is not in the Bible. they set this up. It worked. If God allowed, it worked. But it's not biblical. This is something that they came up with on their own, okay? First, the exorcist, whoever it was, would have to establish communication with the demon. For when the demon speaks, he uses the vocal cords of a person who he indwells. So he's got to get the demon to speak. Second, after establishing communication with the demon, the exorcist would have to find a way to get the demon's name. Basically, he has to get the demon to tell him his name, because by their own oral tradition, they could only cast it out if they had the demon's name. They could order it out by name, and then they could get the demon to come out of the person. If the demon wouldn't speak or was mute, and they couldn't get the person's name, they were dead in the water. They had no recourse past that, okay? And Jesus actually uses that, what's that?
Pharisee.
Yeah, he actually uses their ritual. He actually uses their ritual in Luke 8. So when he's confronted with the man who's been living in the cave, he asks him, he says, what's your name? It's not because he needed to know his name. I mean, he's already cast out demons. This is number 13 on your list, so we're fairly far into his ministry. He's already cast out other demons. He's never done this before. But he's using the Pharisaic ritual to get the demon to come out, just because. Not that he needs to. But so Jesus asks him, what's your name? And he replies and says, we're Legion, because many demons had entered him. And they begged him that he would not command them to go into the abyss. And then that's when he sends them into the pigs. The pigs go into the water. The whole town gets mad and says, would you please leave, because there's something wrong with you. So anyway,
Put our pigs in the water.
so that's him basically using their ritual to cast this demon out, okay? Okay, anybody in here have a Bible that wouldn't mind reading for a second?
What is it?
Would you look up Mark 9, 14 through 29 for me?
Mark 9:13.
14 through 29, just real quick. While you're looking it up, I'm gonna jump ahead for just a second. We're just gonna look at one more that I didn't add here that later I thought is interesting. Okay, so let me know when you got it. So just basically in closing for this section, the one kind of miracle that the Jewish leaders had taught only Jesus could cast out was the mute demon, because you had to have his name to do it, and you couldn't get the name out of a mute demon. Okay, so in light of the second Messianic miracle and in light of the questioning by the masses, the Jewish leaders realized they had to make a public declaration concerning their final decision about Jesus' Messianic claims. They had two options. First, declaring the Messiah in light of all the evidence, or second, was to reject his Messianic claims. Only two options they had. You got it?
Yep.
So go ahead and just read it real quick for me.
And when he came to the 14, starting with verse 14, right?
Yes.
Chapter 9, right?
Yep.
Okay, when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and the scribes disputing with them. Immediately,
All right, stop there for a second. So he's got a multitude of people there, and the scribes are arguing with him. What do you think they're arguing with him about? This guy's about to present a mute, demon-possessed boy to him. What do you think the scribes are trying to tell the people?
He's not real.
He can't do it. Because if he can do it, they've got a problem. So the scribes are trying to convince, in my opinion, they're trying to, because what else are they going to be arguing with him about? They're trying to convince him, don't take this kid to him, because he's not going to be able to do anything about it. Go ahead, sorry, keep going.
immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who has a mute spirit. And wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples, that they should cast it out, but they could not."
Okay, stop, that's good enough. Why couldn't the disciples cast it out?
It was mute.
It was a mute demon. It was reserved for Christ himself.
It didn't have the power.
They didn't have the power or the authority to cast it out, and this was one of the miracles that was reserved for Jesus to do. And he turns around and he does it. So, anyway, I just want to hit that one real quick. And the interesting thing about it is the scribes were actually trying to talk this guy out of taking his demonic possessed son to Jesus because it makes them look bad. Jesus even challenged them. What are you talking to them about? And they're like, well, I have this demon-possessed boy. So, anyway.
So can you say, I mean, this is kind of mean to say this, so that demon-possessed boy was there so Jesus could show who he was?
Exactly.
So it wasn't because of anything that him or his dad or anybody else done, it was for Jesus'
It was for Jesus himself.
edification.
Exactly. And we are going to look at exactly that right now. That was a good lead-in, thank you. That was a perfect lead-in to my next, the healing of a man born blind. So the next miracle that they said only the Messiah could do was the healing of a man born blind. Not someone who's lost their sight along the way, because they had various remedies and things that might be able to give them their sight back. This has to be someone who was born blind, okay? And this has some very interesting Pharisaic teaching in it that I'm going to break down for you as we go through it. Okay, so John 9. Now Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, and he was born blind? And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Now stop there for a second. Think about what the disciples just asked him. He was born blind. They asked, who sinned, this man or his parents? How could he have sinned and caused this if he was born blind? Let me tell you what the Pharisees taught. That question is from Pharisaic teaching. And you don't understand it until you get a little deeper into some of these things that they taught. Let me show you why they asked that question. According to Pharisaic Judaism, at the point of conception, the fetus has two inclinations. In Hebrew, they are called Yetzer Hara, which is the evil inclination, or Yetzer Hartov, the good inclination. These two inclinations are already present when the new human being has just been conceived in the womb. During the 9-month development within the womb, there is a struggle going on for control between the two inclinations.
Wow.
So the Pharisees taught that at the time of conception, the fetus could either choose to be good or evil. So that's why the disciples asked, who sinned, him or his parents? Because they had been taught by the Pharisees that he could choose to be evil at the time of conception. Yeah, let that one sink in for a minute. Okay. When he had said these things, okay, so Jesus is talking to him, and he goes on and says, when he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and he said to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Okay. Now we're going to break that down. You have this in your handout, but not in the slide, not on the slides. Okay, so the pool of Siloam at this exact time is extremely important. Okay, there was a whole bunch of different pools in Jerusalem he could have sent him to wash. He told him to go to this specific one, and there was a reason for it. For starters, from the place that he anointed his eyes to the pool was a long ways, and it was down a steep hill. So him getting there, he's still blind. Him getting there blind is going to be somewhat of a struggle. People are going to see him going. The other thing is, this is in the middle of the Feast of the Tabernacles. It's going on right now. During the Feast of the Tabernacles, there was a tradition that the Jewish leaders had to do, where they would go out, they would draw water to take back to the temple. Guess where they drew it from?
The pool.
The pool of Siloam. So he's in the middle of the day, in the middle of the feast, while the priests are drawing water out of this pool. Jesus sent him to the exact place where all of the religious elite were going to be at that time drawing water for the feast. So this was basically him sending him down there to force all these people to again see what he's doing. Now we have some, yeah, exactly. Now we have some very interesting interaction that goes on here because of it. Okay, so then it goes on to say, therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is this not he who sat and begged? So a whole lot of people have seen him sitting and begging for his whole life, and now he can see. Okay, so now they're having this little discussion. And then some said, this is he. I've seen him before. This is the guy. And others said, no, it can't be him because he's been healed. This can't be the same guy. In the Bible, it just says, he is like him. Basically what they're saying is they're having this conversation, and some of the people are saying, no, that's him. I recognize him. I've seen him my whole life. And the others are saying, but it can't be him because he's blind. This guy's not blind. It can't be the same person. It just has to look like him. Okay, it can't be the same guy.
I just can't accept it.
And finally, after listening to this for a couple of minutes, the blind guy says, no, I'm he. This is me. I'm who you're talking about. I was born blind and now I see. Okay? Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes open? And he answered and said, a man called Jesus, yeah, that's right, okay. A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and I received sight. And they say to him, where is he? And he says, I don't know.
I never saw him.
He's never seen him. So basically, he's been anointed by this guy way up on top of the hill, and he says, go wash. And he walks down the hill, washes, and now everybody's like, where's the guy at? And he's like, I don't know, I couldn't see him when I walked away.
And he was gone when I saw.
Okay? So anyway, as we go on in this little debacle. Okay, so now, because he's done this, and everybody's marveling at it basically, it says, they brought him who was formerly blind to the Pharisees. So now they got a guy, he's just been healed, he's blind since birth, which they know can't be done, so they bring him before the Pharisees. Now what you're going to see, remember we talked about the observation phase and the interrogation phase? You're about to see the interrogation phase in full swing, okay?
Oh boy.
Okay, so they brought him before the Pharisees, and now it was a Sabbath when Jesus had made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees who asked him again how he had received sight, he said, he put clay on my eyes and I washed and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man's not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. Okay, so they've been teaching for 1,000 years that the only person who could heal a person born blind is Jesus. He's just done it, and the best thing they can come up with was, no, he did it on the Sabbath, so it can't be him.
Yeah.
That's their best.
You just can't win with him.
No. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such things? And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? And he said, he must be a prophet. So now that tells you something, because this guy, think about it. A lot of the other guys, they said, I know you're the Messiah, you can heal me. This guy doesn't know that. This guy was not healed by his own faith. This guy doesn't even know this is Jesus yet. He was healed because Jesus chose to heal him. There was no faith on his part because he doesn't know who healed him. This was purely done to show them who Jesus was.
Yeah, he didn't go to him, he came to him.
It says, but the Jews did not believe him concerning it, that he had been blind. But the Jews did not believe him concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called, so now they're calling the parents. So they've got the guy, he says, I was blind, and now I see, so they're going to investigate it. So who's the one person that's going to know for sure he was born blind? Mom and Dad. So they call the parents, and of him who had received his sight, and they asked him, is this your son? And they're going to say, yeah, it is. And it says, who you say was born blind, how then does he now see? So they're asking the parents, if he was born blind, how does he now see? And basically, I'm going to paraphrase here for time, but basically, basically they say, I don't know, he's of age, ask him. All I can tell you is he was born blind, and now he sees, and I can tell you it's my son, but...
He left the house and came back seeing.
Yeah, and I don't know how it happened, ask him. The reason they said that was because the Pharisees were making it well known that if you supported Christ at this time, or the Messiah, you were going to be excommunicated, or cast out of the synagogue. So they're afraid to talk to him because of that. So they didn't want to confess he was the Christ. He will speak for himself. Okay, so they again called the man who was born blind and said to him, "Give God the glory, for we know that this man's a sinner."
And not the man that was healed with,
No, Jesus, because he said,
Oh,
"Give
okay.
God the glory," because they're again trying to disprove Jesus. So he says, "Give God the glory. We know this man's a sinner." And he answered and he says, "Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know." Because again, he doesn't know who Jesus is. "One thing I know is though I was blind, now I see." So he's telling him, I don't know who this guy is. All I can tell you is that I was blind and he made me see.
He put clay on everything.
Okay. Then they said to him again, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And I love the response. And he answered them and said, "I told you already, and you don't listen." and then he says, "Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciple?" So think about it. This poor guy's just been given his sight back, and the only thing he gets for it is this interrogation by the Pharisees, who are trying to prove that it couldn't have happened the way he said it happened. And so he's like, "I don't understand what you want here."
I can see it, that's all I know.
Then they reviled him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he was from." And then the man answered and said, "Why is this a marvelous thing to you, that you don't know where he's from, yet he's opening my eyes? Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does him, he hears him. Since the world began," 32, "since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And then the Pharisees got mad and said, you're born in sin and you're teaching us," and they cast him out of the temple. Because what are they going to say to him?
Almost I could see.
And you notice the comment, it says, "You were completely born in sin." That is their belief that at the time of conception he could choose good or evil. Basically what they're saying when they said you were born in your sin is they're saying you chose evil from before you were born, therefore you have nothing to teach us.
wow.
Okay, he's not done yet.
Okay.
God's not done yet, or Jesus isn't done yet, okay? So now we're going to look at one more. We're going to look at the miracle of raising a person from the dead after the 4th day, okay? This is going to be number 33 on your list of miracles that I've got. And it's talking about Lazarus, okay? Now, another bit of Jewish tradition. The reason it was important that Lazarus was raised on the 4th day was because of Jewish tradition. Okay, now you gotta put yourself in their time frame. Okay, now when someone dies, we hook them up to electronics. We make sure there's no heartbeat. We can check their breathing, all that. And when they pronounce them dead, they're usually dead. Okay, back then it wasn't like that. It was possible for someone to be close to dead or in a coma and have them think they were dead, and then a few days later come back to life. They're not coming back to life, they're just healing, and because they didn't have the technology we had, they might think they were dead, but they weren't. So, by Jewish tradition and Pharisaic law, you had to wait 3 days, okay? Because they believed that someone could resuscitate, not be raised from the dead, but resuscitate within that 3-day period. If after 3 days they still appeared dead, then they pronounced them dead. They were dead. So if you ever wondered why when they said to Jesus, "Hey, Lazarus is sick, we need you to come," he stayed for 2 more days. That's why. He needed Lazarus to be dead for 4 days before he got there, so that he could then again do something that they said couldn't be done. The other interesting thing is if you remember, after Jesus had performed a couple miracles, they said, "Give us a sign." He'd already given them signs, but he said, "Give us a sign." And he responds back, he said, "The only sign that's going to be given you is the sign of Jonah." Which, what happened to Jonah?
He's in the belly.
He's in the belly of a fish or whale, monster, whatever it is, for 3 days, and then he's spit back up on the land. Okay? That's talking about Jesus' death and resurrection. However, it's dual prophecy. It's also talking about Lazarus being dead and raised too. So before Jesus actually dies and then raises again, he actually performed almost the same thing with Lazarus. He dies, he stays in the ground for 4 days, and then he brings him back to life after the 4 days. It's basically a dual prophecy saying, I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to do it. It's going to happen to me. Okay? So we go to John 11. Yeah, John 11. It says, therefore the sisters went to him saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. And when Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not to death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. Okay? Jesus has already raised people from the dead several times. So this is not the first time he's raised someone from the dead. But this specific incident is specifically to glorify him. And right now, if you think about it, so the religious elite have gone through both the observation stage and the interrogation stage of their investigation of him that he started when he healed that first leper. They've now come to the conclusion of that, and they're trying to decide what to do with him. While they're trying to decide what to do with him, he performs this miracle. It says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that, I love this, so when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days. That's not the normal response you get for someone when someone comes and says, hey, this person you love is sick and dying. And he's like, oh, okay, thanks, I'll hang out here for 2 more days. And if you ever read that and thought, why the heck did he do that? This is why he did that. How far did I do?
He stayed 2 more days.
Yeah. It says, then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad. This is another good one. If you've ever thought about this, verse 15, it's on the top of the next page. It says, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sake that I was not here. So he's telling them, you came and told me he was sick. I waited 2 more days. I know he's dead, and I'm glad for your sake that I wasn't here to make him well. That's an interesting statement.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. So when Jesus came, he found so we're going to jump to 40 for time constraints. So go to the bottom of that same page. Just before it, on 27, she said, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And then Jesus goes on to say, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Then he took the stone away. Then they took the stone away from the place where the man was lying. And Jesus lifted his eyes and said, this is an interesting statement. Think about this for a second. Jesus said, Father, I thank you. You've heard me. He hasn't said anything yet. You've heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing here, I now say this. So basically, Jesus is saying, God and I have already talked. He knows what I want. He knows we know what's going to happen. But for your sake, I'm going to say this. And then he says, so that the people can hear, Lazarus, come forth. That was all for the people who were standing there. And then naturally, Lazarus comes forth after being dead for 4 days. Okay? That was the 4th Messianic miracle that they said only the Messiah could do. Okay? And that was actually a precursor to him, what he was going to do, and being died and resurrected from the grave down the road. Okay? So now, you've got all and we're going to be just a couple minutes over, but I'm going to finish it. So just give me a couple more minutes. We're almost there. Now we're going to look at the plot to kill Jesus, okay? So, the religious elite have investigated this, okay? They have looked at it, and now they have to make a decision, okay? So in John 11, you've seen them in the observation phase, and we looked at that, and you could actually see it in the Bible where they wouldn't say anything. You've seen them in the interrogation phase where they're actually interrogating everybody, and now they're coming back together, and now by their own tradition, they have to make a decision. It says, but some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus did. Then the chief priests and Pharisees gathered a council and said, what shall we do? And here's your answer to your question about we were talking about earlier. It says, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone, like this, everyone will believe him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Wow. That was their sole motivation right there. If we leave him alone, we're gonna lose our stuff.
So let's just torture and kill her.
That was it.
Yeah, like a politician.
Like a politician, there you go.
Do
It
anything.
says-
Yeah, true.
Then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. Therefore, Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went into the countryside in the wilderness and basically stayed with his disciples. One last thing. I hate to use the word slap in the face, but so right, and I'm not sure if it, and I couldn't figure it out, and it kind of looks like it's about the same time. About the same time he raises Lazarus from the dead, he does one other miracle. It's number 32 on your list. It shows being just before Lazarus is raised, which is number 33, but it's right about the same time. So you remember Jesus started this whole process by healing one leper and sending it to them and saying, you have to investigate this? Check this out.
Flop, flop.
Then as he entered a certain village, there he met 10 men who were lepers, who stood afar off, and they lifted up their voice and said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. So he saw them and he said, go show yourself to the priest. And so it was as they went, they were cleansed. So what has Jesus just done? He's taken the first miracle they had to look at, and he sent it to them 10 times over. By their own law, now they had to purify all 10 of these and investigate all 10 of their claims. They would have had to go look up the records to see that they were truly leprous. They would have had to go find out if they were truly healed, and then they would have had to try and prove who healed them. So while they're plotting his death, he sends them a repetition of 10 of what the first miracle that he performed to show them that he was the Messiah, and forces them to look at it while they're plotting his death.
Good for Jesus.
So,
But courage.
well, I went over a few minutes. I did fit it into one lesson.
So good.
Does anybody have any questions? I'm open to any questions.
Were there so many demons back then, and now we have so much mental problem? I mean,
Is that a coincidence or what? Okay, all right. Let me tell you something, okay? And I don't know how many of you know what I do for a living, but I've been with the sheriff. I've been a police officer in some form for 30 years, okay? I've dealt with a lot of people. I truly believe a lot of the issues we have today are demonically induced.
Yes.
Whether they're possession or oppression,
Yes.
I can tell you things that I have experienced and witnessed, and things that I can tell you a lot of the stuff we deal with are exactly the same things they were dealing with back then. We just don't look at them the same way anymore.
Yeah.
So would somebody mind closing for me in prayer? Go ahead. Thank you.
Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the word that you gave us, and for a place we can study it and hear it, and for a teacher who will teach us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for coming out. There's still some cookies and stuff left in the back.
Thank you.